Well, I am very interested in the subject of human misjudgment, and Lord knows I've created a good bit of it. I don't think I've created my full statistical share, and I think that one of the reasons was that I tried to do something about this terrible ignorance I left the Harvard Law School with when I saw this patterned irrationality, which was so extreme, and I had no theory or anything to deal with it, but I could see that it was extreme and I could see that it was patterned. I just started to create my own system of psychology, partly by casual reading, but largely from personal experience, and I used that pattern to help me get through life. Fairly late in life, I stumbled into this book, Influence, by a psychologist named Bob Cialdini, who became a super tenured hotshot on a 2,000-person faculty at a very young age. And he wrote this book, which has now sold 300,000 copies, which is remarkable for it's an academic book aimed at a popular audience. And that filled in a lot of holes in my crude system. And when those holes had filled in, I thought I had a system that was a good working tool, and I'd like to share that one with you. And I came here because behavioral economics, how could economics not be behavioral? If it isn't behavioral, what the hell is it? I think it's fairly clear that all reality has to respect all other reality. If you come to inconsistencies, they have to be resolved. And so the idea of if there's anything valid in psychology, economics has to recognize it, and vice versa. So I think the people that are working on this fringe between economics and psychology are absolutely right to be there, and I think there's been plenty wrong over the years. Well, let me romp through as much of this list as I have time to get through. 24 standard causes of human misjudgment. First, under recognition of the power of what psychologists call reinforcement and economists call incentives. Well, you can say everybody knows that. Well, I think I've been in the top 5% of my age cohort all my life in understanding the power of incentives, and all my life I've underestimated it. And never a year passes but when I get some surprise that pushes my limit a little farther. So one of my favorite cases about the power of incentives is the Federal Express case, where heart and soul of the integrity of the system is that all the packages have to be shifted rapidly in one central location each night. And the system has no integrity if the whole shift can't be done fast. And Federal Express had one hell of a time getting the thing to work. And they tried moral suasion, they tried everything in the world, and finally somebody got the happy thought that they were paying the night shift by the hour, and that maybe if they paid them by the shift, the system would work better. And lo and behold, that solution worked. Early in the history of Xerox, Joe Wilson, who was then in the government, had to go back to Xerox because he couldn't understand how their better new machine was selling so poorly in relation to their older and inferior machine. Of course, when he got there, he found out that the commission arrangement with the salesman gave a tremendous incentive to the inferior machine. And here at Harvard, in the shadow of B.F. Skinner, there was a man who really was into reinforcement as a powerful thought. And, you know, Skinner has lost his reputation in a lot of places. But if you were to analyze the entire history of experimental science at Harvard, he'd be in the top handful. His experiments were very ingenious, the results were counterintuitive, and they were important. It is not given to experimental science to do better. What gummed up Skinner's reputation is that he developed a case of what I always call man with a hammer syndrome. To the man with a hammer, every problem tends to look pretty much like a nail. And Skinner had one of the more extreme cases in the history of academia, and this syndrome doesn't exempt bright people. It's just a man with a hammer. And Skinner is extreme example of that. And later, as I go down my list, let's go back and try and figure out why people like Skinner get man with a hammer syndrome. Incidentally, when I was at the Harvard Law School, there was a professor, naturally at Yale, who was derisively discussed at Harvard, and they used to say, "Poor old Blanchard, he thinks declaratory judgments will cure cancer." And that's the way Skinner got. And not only that, he got he was literary, and he scorned opponents who had any different way of thinking or thought anything else was important. This is not a way to make a lasting reputation if the other people turn out to also be doing something important. My second factor is simple psychological denial. This first really hit me between the eyes when a friend of our family had a super athlete, super student son who flew off a carrier in the North Atlantic and never came back. And his mother, who was a very sane woman, just never believed he was dead. And, of course, if you turn on the television, you find the mothers of the most obvious criminals that man could ever diagnose, and they all think their sons are innocent. Simple psychological denial. The reality is too painful to bear, so you just distort it until it's bearable. We all do that to some extent, and it's a common psychological misjudgment that causes terrible problems. Third, incentive-caused bias, both in one's own mind and that of one's trusted advisor, where it creates what economists call agency costs. Here, my early experience was a doctor who sent bushel baskets full of normal gallbladders down to the pathology lab in a leading hospital in Lincoln, Nebraska. And with that quality control for which community hospitals are famous, about 5 years after he should have been removed from the staff, he was. And one of the old doctors who participated in the removal was also a family friend. And I asked him, I said, "Tell me, did he think here's a way for me to exercise my talents?" This guy was very skilled, technically, and make a high living by doing a few maimings and murders every year, along with some frauds. He said, "Hell no, Charlie." He thought that the gallbladder was the source of all medical evil, and that if you really loved your patients, you couldn't get that organ out rapidly enough. Now, that's an extreme case, but in lesser strength, it's present in every profession and in every human being. And it causes perfectly terrible behavior. If you take sales presentations of brokers of commercial real estate and businesses, I'm 70 years old. I've never seen one I thought was even within hailing distance of objective truth. And if you want to talk about the power of incentives and the power to rationalize terrible behavior, after the Defense Department had had enough experience with cost-plus percentage of cost contracts, the reaction of our republic was to make it a crime for the federal government to write one. And not only a crime, but a felony. And by the way, the government's right. But a lot of the way the world is run, including most law firms and a lot of other places, they've still got a cost-plus percentage of cost system. And human nature, with its version of what I call incentive-caused bias, causes this terrible abuse. And many of the people who are doing it, you would be glad to have marry into your family compared to what you're otherwise going to get. Now, there are huge implications from the fact that human mind is put together this way, and that is that people who create things like cash registers, which make misbehavior hard, are some of the effective saints of our civilization. And the cash register was a great moral instrument when it was created, and Patterson knew that, by the way. He had a little store, and the people were stealing him blind and never made any money, and people sold him a couple of cash registers, and it went to profit immediately. And of course, he closed the store and went into the cash register business, and with results which are so this is a huge important thing. If you read the psychology text, you will find that if they're 1,000 pages long, there's one sentence. Somehow incentive-caused bias has escaped the standard survey course in psychology. Fourth, and this is a superpower in error-causing psychological tendency, Bias from consistency and commitment tendency, including the tendency to avoid or promptly resolve cognitive dissonance. Includes the self-confirmation tendency of all conclusions, particularly expressed conclusions, and with a special persistence for conclusions that are hard-won. But what I'm saying here is that the human mind is a lot like the human egg. And the human egg has a shut-off device. When one sperm gets in, it shuts down so the next one can't get in. The human mind has a big tendency of the same sort. And here again, it doesn't just catch ordinary mortals, it catches the deans of physics. According to Max Planck, the really innovative, important new physics was never really accepted by the old guard. Instead, a new guard came along that was less brain-blocked by its previous conclusions. And if Max Planck's crowd had this consistency and commitment tendency that kept their old conclusions intact in spite of disconfirming evidence, you can imagine what the crowd that you and I are part of behaves like. And of course, if you make a public disclosure of your conclusion, you're pounding it in to your own head. Many of these students that are screaming at us, they aren't convincing us, but they're forming mental chains for themselves, because what they're shouting out, they're pounding in. And I think educational institutions that create a climate where too much of that goes on are, in a fundamental sense, they're irresponsible institutions. It's very important to not put your brain in chains too young by what you shout out. And all these things like painful qualifying and initiation rituals, and all those things pound in your commitments and your ideas. And the Chinese brainwashing system, which was for war prisoners, which was way better than anybody else's, they maneuvered people into making tiny little commitments and declarations, and then they'd slowly build. That worked way better than torture.